Kickboxing event, the guys you fight don't even have a chance. I mean, they don't even touch you. And he said, no, we'll make this a seesaw battle. And so we made it fight back and forth and do that, fighting. But again, he respected me, my ability as a world champion at the time.
In the golden age of American martial arts, two names stood above the rest: Chuck Norris and Joe Lewis. They were brothers in battle, pioneers who brought discipline and honor to a new generation of fighters. Together, they turned karate into a global phenomenon. But behind the trophies, smiles, and handshakes, there was tension, pride, competition, and eventually, silence. Decades later, that silence has finally been broken. What really happened between the Hollywood legend and the man once called the greatest fighter alive? Join us as we uncover more. Brothers in Arms. In the mid-1960s, the American martial arts scene was a battlefield of ego, grit, and innovation. Back then, karate wasn't the sleek, Hollywood-polished sport we know today. It was raw, bruising, and fiercely competitive. And standing at the center of that storm were two men, Chuck Norris and Joe Lewis. Both were military-trained warriors. Norris had served in the U.S. Air Force in South Korea, where he first discovered Tang Soo Do.
Chuck Norris is a movie, martial arts, and pop culture powerhouse. He starred in more than 20 films.
Lewis, a proud Marine, had his own encounters with combat discipline and hand-to-hand fighting. When the two finally met, it was like steel striking steel. They recognized something rare in each other, an unshakable sense of focus and respect. In the early tournaments, they weren't rivals. They were brothers in arms. They trained together, sparred for endless hours, and pushed each other to new heights. Joe Lewis became Chuck's sparring partner. But to many, he was more than that. He was the only man who could truly challenge Chuck Norris on the mat. Together, they began reshaping American karate. The two helped transform it from a niche, imported art into a national phenomenon. Their matches drew huge crowds, and soon karate schools across the U.S. began to boom in popularity. Old photos from that era show them laughing, arms over each other's shoulders, sweaty after training sessions that would leave others gasping. One student who trained under them recalled that when you watched Chuck and Joe spar, you didn't breathe. It was like watching lightning fight thunder. In 1967, both men competed at the All-American Karate Championships. Norris emerged the victor, but instead of rivalry, the audience saw mutual admiration. Joe was the first to congratulate him. Cameras caught the moment, Chuck raising Joe's hand in respect. That image became symbolic of the purity of martial arts friendship. Together, they represented everything martial arts was meant to stand for: discipline, honor, and brotherhood. Fans adored them as the perfect balance. Norris, the calm technician with an iron will; Joe, the explosive powerhouse with unmatched aggression. They weren't just fighters, they were ambassadors. As their influence grew, they taught seminars together, visited dojos across America, and appeared in martial arts magazines side by side. For young fighters in the 60s and early 70s, they were the dream team. But behind the scenes, subtle cracks began to form. Success has a strange way of testing loyalty. As Norris's Hollywood charm began catching attention outside the dojo, whispers started swirling. Some insiders claimed Joe was frustrated that Chuck's growing fame was overshadowing his own skill. Others said Chuck never meant to take the spotlight. He was just following opportunities as they came. Still, those who knew them best sensed the shift, and as time went on, those wounds only deepened. By the early 1970s, Chuck Norris was no longer just a martial arts champion. He was becoming a brand. His fame skyrocketed after appearing alongside Bruce Lee in Way of the Dragon, 1972. That legendary fight scene in the Roman Colosseum made Chuck a household name. Meanwhile, Joe Lewis, though respected and feared in the ring, remained tied to the martial arts circuit. He was known as the greatest karate fighter of all time, but the spotlight seemed to shine more brightly on his old friend. At first, Joe brushed it off. He was proud of Chuck's success. But as the media began portraying Norris as the ultimate martial arts icon, the bitterness began to creep in. Chuck was becoming a star, and Joe wanted recognition. The breaking point reportedly came in 1974. Rumor has it, a film producer approached Joe Lewis with a movie offer that would have paired him with Chuck Norris on screen, a martial arts blockbuster showcasing their legendary chemistry. But Joe turned it down, allegedly saying he didn't want to play second fiddle to Chuck. That single decision marked the start of their silent feud. Chuck moved deeper into Hollywood, eventually headlining his own movies and later the iconic TV series Walker, Texas Ranger. Joe stayed true to the competitive world, training, coaching, and fighting. While Chuck was learning camera angles and scripts, Joe was perfecting knockout kicks and new fighting systems. Fans began to notice the distance. The two rarely appeared together anymore. Interviewers would ask about the other, and both men gave polite, vague answers. Never hostile, but never warm either. Still, those close to them knew the truth. The brotherhood was gone. The betrayal, rumors. By the mid-1970s, whispers had turned into full-blown rumors. The brotherhood that once inspired a generation of fighters now seemed fractured beyond repair. People in the martial arts community could feel it. Something had gone terribly wrong between Chuck Norris and Joe Lewis. The breaking point reportedly came at a martial arts convention in Los Angeles, sometime around 1974 or 1975. The two legends were both scheduled to appear, though neither had spoken privately in months. Witnesses described the atmosphere as tense enough to cut with a blade. During a panel discussion, the topic of Hollywood's growing influence on martial arts came up. That's when, according to several attendees, Joe Lewis made a remark that stunned everyone in the room. He allegedly said, "Some people forget where they came from once the cameras start rolling." Everyone knew who he was talking about. The crowd went silent. Chuck Norris, seated just a few chairs away, didn't respond. He simply smiled politely, nodded, and let the moderator move on. But the message was clear. Joe had just accused his former best friend of abandoning the true spirit of martial arts for fame and money. After that day, the story spread like wildfire. Every martial arts magazine, dojo gossip circle, and fan newsletter had a version of the incident. Some painted Joe as the jealous friend who couldn't handle Chuck's success. Others portrayed Chuck as the Hollywood sellout who left his brother behind. A writer for Black Belt magazine at the time wrote, "It feels like watching Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan turn on each other. Two warriors who once fought side by side, now standing worlds apart." For years, Chuck remained silent. He refused to talk about Joe publicly, even when pressed during interviews. "Joe's a great fighter," was all he would say, nothing more. But his silence only fueled speculation. Fans wanted answers. Did fame change Chuck Norris? Or was Joe Lewis struggling with envy? Behind closed doors, people who trained with both men offered conflicting accounts. Some claimed Joe had tried to reconcile and was met with cold distance. Others said Chuck had reached out and Joe refused to meet him halfway. And then came the interviews. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Joe Lewis began speaking out more openly about their friendship, or rather what was left of it. Even other martial arts legends were divided. Some defended Chuck, saying he had done more to popularize the sport than anyone else. Others sympathized with Joe, believing he had been unfairly written out of history.
19-year-old Joe Lewis was fresh out of the Marines. He was so dedicated to Okinawan karate.
One old associate of both men later revealed that Joe felt betrayed, not because Chuck got famous, but because he felt forgotten. He believed he helped build Chuck's foundation, and when the lights came on, he was left standing in the dark. Meanwhile, Chuck remained a ghost in the conversation. He avoided interviews that mentioned Joe's name, refused to comment on the rumors, and focused on his acting career and teaching philosophy. To outsiders, it looked like indifference, but some who knew him privately claimed Chuck was deeply hurt, not by Joe's words, but by how public they had become. As the years passed, the rift solidified. They were no longer friends, not even rivals, just two legends whose paths had split forever. Yet the martial arts community wouldn't let it go. Articles kept rehashing the feud. Fans debated it on early internet forums, and journalists chased quotes from anyone remotely connected to either man. The story had become a myth, a tragic saga of pride, betrayal, and silence. And just when the public thought the story had faded, Joe Lewis reignited the fire with comments that shocked even Norris's most loyal fans. You won't believe what it was. Joe Lewis strikes back. For years after the fallout, the story of Chuck Norris and Joe Lewis drifted quietly beneath the surface, a painful chapter that most assumed was over. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, Joe Lewis reignited the storm. And this time, he didn't hold back. It started subtly. In scattered interviews, Joe began hinting that Hollywood had created a myth around Chuck Norris, that the man on screen wasn't the same as the fighter he once knew in the ring. But soon, those hints turned into direct hits. In one widely circulated martial arts seminar video, Joe said that Chuck wasn't as tough as people thought. He was good, no doubt, but not unbeatable. The movies made him invincible. Real fights are different. The audience in that seminar laughed nervously, unsure whether to take it as a joke or a jab. But online, especially in early martial arts forums and fan newsletters, the quote exploded. Fans began debating furiously. Had Joe Lewis just called Chuck Norris overrated? A few weeks later, he doubled down in another interview. This time, Joe brought Bruce Lee into the mix. He claimed that during training sessions in the late 1960s, Bruce had openly told him that he was the best fighter he had ever seen. That single statement sent shockwaves through the martial arts community. For years, Chuck had been publicly linked with Bruce Lee, their friendship immortalized in Way of the Dragon.
The mythology on Bruce Lee, who you knew very well, and actually your first movie...
I did my first film with him in 1972.
What was he like?
But now Joe was implying that Bruce had admired him more, not Chuck. Despite the noise, Chuck Norris stayed completely silent. No interviews, no rebuttals, no subtle posts or statements. He carried on with his charity work, his motivational tours, and his acting career. To many, that silence was a sign of dignity. To others, it looked like avoidance. Every so often, journalists tried to stir the pot. They'd ask Chuck about Joe in interviews, trying to bait a reaction, but he never took it. Behind that calm, though, insiders say Chuck was deeply hurt. Not by Joe's words themselves, but by how easily the public believed them. The two had once been brothers, men who fought side by side, taught together, and trusted each other like family. Seeing that bond turned into gossip headlines must have stung in ways Chuck never showed. Meanwhile, Joe continued teaching, coaching, and occasionally giving candid reflections on his past. Still, for fans, the damage was done. The image of Chuck Norris and Joe Lewis as an inseparable duo had shattered long ago. What remained was a lingering question: what really happened between them? For nearly 5 decades, Chuck Norris refused to give his side of the story. His silence became part of the myth. People assumed he'd never speak, that he'd take whatever truth existed to his grave. Until now. For nearly 5 decades, Chuck Norris never spoke publicly about Joe Lewis. The silence became a story of its own, a mystery that fueled endless speculation. Fans assumed he would never break it, that whatever happened between them was too personal, too painful to revisit. But then, unexpectedly, he did. In a recent interview reflecting on his career and the people who shaped it, Chuck finally addressed Joe Lewis by name. The tone was emotional, heavy with the weight of years gone by. For the first time, the man who built his image on stoic strength showed a flicker of vulnerability. He acknowledged that there had indeed been tension between them. It wasn't a denial or a dismissal. Instead, it was a quiet confession of something far more human. He admitted that they had drifted apart not because of Hollywood or money, but because of something deeper: pride. Both men, he explained, had strong wills and uncompromising spirits. Neither was willing to bend. There was no anger in his tone, only reflection. He spoke of Joe with unmistakable respect, describing him as one of the finest martial artists he had ever known. There was a sense that, beneath all the years of silence, admiration had never truly left. He went further, describing Joe Lewis as a man of unmatched drive and skill, someone who had pushed the boundaries of American karate and transformed the way the world saw martial arts. He referred to Joe as the greatest fighter America ever produced, a title many had whispered but few expected Chuck himself to affirm. In that moment, the bitterness of the past seemed to fade. It felt like closure. a long overdue tribute from one legend to another. For longtime fans who had followed their story since the 1960s, it was both healing and heartbreaking. Yet, just as the tension seemed to lift, Chuck's tone shifted slightly. His reflection turned from nostalgia to honesty, perhaps too much honesty. He hinted that the real reason for their rift went beyond competition and ego. It was something internal, something that neither man could control at the time. He admitted that pride had played a larger role than anyone realized. It wasn't fame that divided them, he said, but the inability of two strong men to meet halfway. In his voice there was regret, the quiet recognition that they might have both lost something irreplaceable because neither wanted to appear weaker. It was the kind of revelation that carried both sincerity and sorrow. For years, fans had debated who was at fault, but now Chuck seemed to be saying it didn't matter anymore. Both men had shared a brotherhood that fame, rivalry, and time had eroded, but never fully erased. The interview felt like a final bow to an old chapter. It was respectful, emotional, and reflective. Viewers felt as though they were hearing the truth at last. But then, near the end, Chuck said something that would undo all the goodwill his words had created, something that reignited old arguments and divided fans all over again. But it's what he said next that made fans furious. The moment that changed everything came near the end of the interview. What began as a heartfelt tribute to Joe Lewis suddenly took an unexpected turn. Chuck spoke candidly about Joe's temperament in their later years, suggesting that anger had shaped much of how their relationship unfolded. He implied that Joe's unwillingness to let go of resentment had prevented reconciliation. It was a subtle remark, not meant as an attack, but it carried an edge that struck many fans the wrong way. He went on to reflect that Joe's career might have reached even greater heights if he had learned to temper his pride. It was a statement that sounded analytical, even philosophical, but to many it felt like a judgment, especially since Joe was no longer alive to respond. Almost immediately, social media erupted. Clips of the interview began circulating across platforms with fiery captions and divided opinions. Some viewers praised Chuck for his honesty, arguing that he was simply offering perspective after years of silence. They saw it as a moment of truth, a man finally unburdening himself after decades of speculation. But others were outraged. To them, Chuck's comments were disrespectful, even cruel. They accused him of tarnishing a man's legacy when he was no longer around to defend himself. Many felt he had waited too long to speak, and that doing so now, in such a critical tone, betrayed the respect he claimed to have. Comment sections filled with emotional reactions. Some wrote that Chuck was just being transparent, that no friendship is perfect, and no fighter is without flaws. Others countered that he had crossed a line, that true respect means protecting a friend's memory, not dissecting it in hindsight. Online forums buzzed with debates. Longtime martial arts enthusiasts began revisiting old footage, interviews, and photos, trying to read between the lines of their shared history. Even martial arts publications weighed in, analyzing whether Chuck's remarks were reflective honesty or unnecessary controversy. The backlash grew rapidly. Some fans declared they had lost respect for Norris entirely, calling his timing unfair and his tone arrogant. Others defended him, saying he had earned the right to tell his truth, that his words came from a place of closure, not malice. The story dominated headlines in the martial arts community for weeks. It wasn't just about two men anymore. It became a discussion about legacy, loyalty, and the fine line between honesty and betrayal. And just when it seemed the debate had reached its peak, another voice entered the conversation, one that reignited emotions all over again. But there's more, because Joe's family had something to say too. A few days after Chuck Norris's interview went viral, a statement surfaced from Joe Lewis's family. It was brief but powerful, and it reignited the debate that had already divided the martial arts world. To them, it meant something that after years of silence, Chuck had finally spoken about their relationship and given Joe the public respect he deserved. While they appreciated the tribute, they couldn't overlook what they called the misplaced remark about humility. The family made it clear that Joe's passion and pride were not flaws, but driving forces, the same qualities that made him a pioneer in the sport. They argued that his assertiveness had been mistaken for anger, and that he had spent his entire life mentoring students, building champions, and defending the integrity of martial arts long after Hollywood moved on. The message struck a chord. To many fans, it felt like a dignified but sharp reminder that history should not be rewritten through one person's lens.
Joe's level, which was a professional athletic type level.
Not even Chuck Norris's. In the end, beyond the interviews, rumors, and heated debates, one truth remains undeniable. Chuck Norris and Joe Lewis reshaped American martial arts forever. Their names are woven into the very foundation of the sport, each man representing a distinct philosophy, yet both driven by the same relentless pursuit of excellence. Do you think fame truly changed Chuck Norris, or was Joe Lewis simply misunderstood? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, click on the next video on your screen. You'll love it.